Libraries are inspirational.
Libraries are free. Just stop and think about that a minute. Just have that moment, just think. Libraries are free.
I'd say libraries are alive.
Libraries are listening spaces.
Everywhere you go in Manchester, there's a library. Manchester is Library City. It is home to some of the most amazing, spectacular libraries.
I just think libraries are essential.
Library is an open space for everyone.
Libraries are a home from home.
Libraries are places of sanctuary.
Libraries are fun.
Libraries are activators of change.
Libraries seem to be the best kept secret, so I'm sharing this secret with you.
And here we are in the heart of our busy and noisy city of Manchester, outside the Portico Library, which is still in its original Georgian building, one of the only Georgian buildings left in Manchester. And come with me and we'll go in. Because it's free to enter. Anyone can enter. All you need to do is press that button and you will be allowed into this gem of Manchester. There are a lot of stairs, but you'll also notice the portico understands people need a rest, so there are chairs along the way. So prepare yourself for the beauties of the Portico Library. So in 1806, when the Portico Library opened, the first secretary was a Mr. Roget. Yes, that is Roget of Roget's Thesaurus. But it isn't just people who write books who are members of the Portico Library. Eric Cantona was a member as well. And the Portico is one of Manchester's favourite lunch spots and has been since 1806. And you can dine under the dome. You'll also notice that there is a weather vane in the far corner. That's not a clock. It's actually saying 20 to west at the moment. The Portico Library is also famous for being home to polite literature, and that might not mean quite the same thing now as it did in 1806. Polite literature meant reading for pleasure. And something else that the Portico Library has is an adopt a book scheme. The books you can see here with white tapes tied around them are in need of some TLC, and you can adopt a book and get it rebound. As well as being a library, the Portico is home to a lovely shop with postcards and notebooks with items from the library on them, and it's also an exhibition space with regular free exhibitions. You can come into the library anytime and see the exhibitions, and all the exhibitions are related to the collection and tell a story about the collection. And isn't that what libraries are for? To tell stories.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Manchester, welcome to the Festival of Libraries, and welcome to Day 2 of the Knowledge Exchange. I'm Arden Wadeson. I'm Executive Director at Manchester City of Literature. That's the organisation that manages the city's UNESCO designation on behalf of Manchester City Council, the University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, and over 30 partner organisations, festivals, independent publishers, specialist writing agencies, universities, and of course libraries. This is the second day of a 2-day online conference for library professionals. Yesterday, we heard from Sue Williamson, Director of Libraries at Arts Council England, Shirley Yearwood-Jackman, who's Library Liaison at the University of Liverpool. We heard about Libraries of Sanctuary in Oldham, Bolton and Manchester Libraries. And we heard from Lydia Hunar, who is a writer working on a Future Libraries Commission as part of the Festival of Libraries public programme. For those of you who weren't there yesterday, that was just a quick flavour of who was speaking, and you can watch yesterday's conference online on the YouTube channel from Manchester City of Literature. So the Festival of Libraries public programme, this event sits within a wider public programme of 80 events in libraries across Greater Manchester that started yesterday and runs through to Sunday. I hope you'll be able to visit some of those events wherever you are in the world. Some are in person, some are outdoor, but many are online. The public programme aims to celebrate libraries, the impact they have on the place they are based and of the people. So we want to celebrate the people who make libraries what they are, those who work in them and those who use them, and the extraordinary stories that come out of the everyday use of libraries. So a huge thank you to Arts Council England and to UK National Lottery players for the support to make this happen. And a huge thanks to all our library partners across Greater Manchester who've been instrumental in bringing this festival together, which we hope will be an annual event. You just heard from Rosie Garland. She's a writer, novelist and performer based here in Manchester, and she has made a series of videos for us about some of the historic libraries in the city centre of Manchester and also our newest library, the Poetry Library, and we'll be showing those throughout the day. So the aim of today really is to take you away from your day job momentarily, to find space to think, reflect, meet peers, swap ideas and experiences. So this morning we'll have presentations from a series of speakers. They'll be in sort of 45-minute blocks, and then we'll have 5 or 10-minute breaks between those. So please give our speakers your full attention, contribute fully to the debates, and join in the discussions this afternoon. So if you've got questions for any of our speakers, use the Q&A function. If you want to introduce yourself, as I see some of you are, use chat, and also post comments on what you're hearing in chat as well. So we have library staff, library professionals, information professionals from not just the UK, but around the world joining us today. Booked on, we have librarians from independent, heritage, academic, specialist libraries and public libraries across Greater Manchester, across the UK, also from Reykjavik, Iowa City, Sao Paulo, Dublin, Bouchon and Toronto. Welcome all. We asked some of you what you were interested from this event, and the overwhelming response was about networking and learning for others. So that's really going to be our theme for today. If you are on social media, please do comment using the hashtag Festival of Libraries and copy in Manchester City of Literature, which is at MCR City of Lit. So I'm going to hand over now to Neil MacInnes, who is Director of Libraries, Culture and Galleries at Manchester City Council, to say a few words before our main speaker. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Ivan. Good morning. I'm really delighted to join you this morning at this most amazing Festival of Libraries. I've been involved with Manchester City of Literature from day one, when the initial thinking and planning started all those years ago. And I've been really excited about the idea of a Festival of Libraries and what is truly a library city. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I have to congratulate everyone for what is a fabulous programme of events and activity. And this has far surpassed what I ever thought could be possible. So it's truly wonderful to see this idea and concept being taken from vision to venture. I'm so pleased to introduce Marie Østergård this morning, who is not only a colleague, but also a friend of mine. I had the pleasure of visiting the beautiful Danish city of Aarhus in 2007 to attend an international library conference. And I was really impressed with the thinking and plans for their new library. And it gave me a lot of inspiration and ideas to help shape our thinking about the potential for a transformed Manchester Central Library, which we longed for. When we were given the green light to create a new vision for Manchester Central Library, we kept in touch with our Aarhus colleagues and had a lot of conversations, a lot of thought sharing and learning. And that was part of our roadmap on the journey to the completed product here in Manchester. Dock 1 is, in my opinion, one of the most impressive public libraries in the world, after Manchester Central Library, of course, he said very modestly. But Dock 1 has helped to shape and inform many other new libraries in the world. I've visited many times, and each time I find something new to inspire me. And I also have my favourite thinking spot in the library overlooking the waterfront. Marie and I have continued to work together in different guises. We both had the pleasure to present at the India Public Libraries Conference in 2015, held in Delhi, sharing our journeys. And we're both board members of Public Libraries 2030, a European public libraries organisation, which aims to connect, innovate and advocate for public libraries across Europe, which I'm delighted that Manchester Library still remains connected to. Finally, in 2019, the wider cultural links between our two cities got even stronger, with a unique and forward-thinking agreement being signed by Manchester and the Danish cities of Aarhus and Aalborg to pave the way for future cultural collaboration, which will focus on arts and health, young people, urban development and design. This is supported by Arts Council England and the Danish Agency for Culture and Palaces, and the agreement is expected to benefit artists, cultural organisations and audiences in both Manchester and Denmark. Marie is a true library avenger, advocate and ambassador, and I know you will thoroughly enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
I will just unmute myself and then I'll say thank you very much, Neil, and thank you for this wonderful introduction. I just want to give it back saying that we've treasured the cooperation between Aarhus and Manchester for many, many years, and we do always treasure the opportunity to work across borders, because that's how we get inspiration to keep moving forward. And especially in Manchester is one of our favorite places to go and have a look. So we have a lot of good conversations about the development of libraries with Neil and his team. So I also want to thank you for inviting me to this conference, because for us in Aarhus, the whole City of Literature concept is one of the most important ones at the moment. And we are right now actually getting ready to start tonight our Literature Exchange Festival, which is 10 days of literature all around Aarhus in small, big events, shared events, on traditional formats, etc., etc. So, so that it's the best day ever to be on this festival as well. Right. So I started sharing my screen, and I just need someone. Neil, can you give me a nod if the screen is shared in presentation mode?
Marie, it's Ivan. We can see perfectly.
Okay, so it's good in presentation mode. Excellent. Okay, so I'm gonna go through. This is 25 minutes of me being quick, and we're already a little behind schedule. So, and I will not catch up on those moments. I just have to say that up front. But anyway, I'm going to talk about the library as a democratic infrastructure. And here it says Doc 1, but basically it could just say any library, because I think that is a very important point of what we need to be as libraries and what we can be and what some libraries already are. So I'm not going to talk about, I'm probably not going to say at all anytime the new normal, because I think what we need to talk about now is the core and not before and after. And I'm also not going to go into the whole new digital development that we've all been going through the past year, because I know a lot of people will be talking about that, and there's already been so much good sharing around that. So I'm going to try and focus on something else, on community infrastructure, on how to use user involvement in order to create libraries as democratic space in town square, and how we work with partnerships and programming, and the library as a democratic space. So when I talk about the library as a community infrastructure, this is this is actually a map of the municipality of Aarhus, and the little green dots are libraries. So as you can see, we're spread out with 19 libraries, with one main library, which is Dock 1, and then 18 branches. We're spread out through the municipality, and this is the case in many, many places around the world. We sometimes seem to forget that this network of physical spaces is really an infrastructure that contains power, and it's an infrastructure of community spaces that we need to use to the best that we can, because they are really community centers. They're knowledge hubs, and libraries go out into the smallest parts of our cities or our local communities, and that's an opportunity that we should always have in mind. When we talk about what a library is, these brilliant guys, Østergård, Jacobsen, and Scott Hansen, they developed this model explaining how libraries are three things. Libraries are a place, a space, and it's about relations. And when we think about how to be a library, it's super important that we make sure that we focus and nourish all these three different dimensions of the library, because only in doing so can we be that space for meeting and the third space, or whatever you want to call it, in a community. So when I talk about the library as a democratic space, it's of course because when you refer to a library, it's quite evident that in our societies there are no non-commercial spaces where you meet across gender and age, and political conviction or educational background, and meet across all these different things. So this is really like the town square in old cities, where you met and you exchanged gossip, or you heard what was going on, or you discussed big issues. This is what the library should be, because this is where everybody can go without having to pay money, and actually get in contact with each other, with media, with knowledge, and also to express themselves. And that is a very unique position for libraries. And we're just happy that there's a roof on it, because in Denmark the weather's super bad. Otherwise we could just have it as an open square. But we have to cherish this and acknowledge the importance of this. So when we talk about the library, we often talk about it as a mashup. So really it's a square, it's walls and a roof around a lot of different types of activities, not necessarily carried out by the library itself. So we're basically this mashup that mashes up different kinds of services from different kinds of partners coming in and providing the community and the citizens with the different services that they're looking for, or that they didn't even know they were looking for. And the reason I point to this is that I think that we need to, in order to fulfill that role as a democratic space and as a town square, we need to open up our doors and give away our spaces to the partners that are out there and who has relevant services and ideas to share with the rest of the community. So in Aarhus, we take partnership really seriously, and we have a very strong partnership strategy that we've been working on for many years. This is a work that we spend a lot of time on, because we know that in order for us to be the community space that we need to be, we need to make sure that the local community come in and is part of what the library is. So we have around, in Dock 1 alone, we have around 140 programs a month. 50% of those are carried out by or with partners, and that is intentional. Of course, it's also amazing because they bring in competences and their own network, and they teach us stuff, but it is also part of being that city hub, the community hub that we need to be as libraries. And we need to make sure that every single staff member is capable of creating partnerships and creating programming from those partnerships without having to go through a long bureaucratic road to get acceptance or decisions made from the leadership. This is something that needs to happen in every single corner of the library organization. So as Neil, you pointed out, the first time you were in Aarhus I think in 2007, and at that time we were in an old library, not having built Doc 1 yet, but already then we'd begun to talk a lot about user involvement and design thinking, because that needed to be part of our development into being this democratic space and open community center. So design thinking is the tool that we chose. There are tons of different user involvement methods, and I think what we're at right now is a sample of design thinking mindset, but also sampling in a lot of different other activities that is say resembles the way that we think in Aarhus. It can be done in many different ways. Design thinking is a mindset and it's a tool for co-creation, but most of all, it's an attitude. It's really, it has to do with how you view your surroundings, how you view the people who come into the libraries, or how you go out and meet them in their own environments. And it's about listening and reflecting. So this is something that we've trained our entire staff in for a long time. In 2013, we got a big grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to create a design thinking toolkit for libraries. And after that, we've been traveling around the world to train library staff around the world in how to use it. And as you can see, that design thinking toolkit, which was there in 2013, was sort of halfway towards where we are now, because we had been practicing a lot before. It helped shape the Doc 1 that we have today, and now we're actually on the other side of it, making design thinking a service for citizens, so that they can use it for their own purposes. So the toolkit is free. It's available online. You can download it, and it's actually translated, I think, into 16 or 18 different languages now. So it's being used widely around the world. We use it heavily for prototyping in our library spaces, with staff, with partners, and with citizens. So a lot of the time we have a lot of cardboard boxes around the library spaces, and it looks quite messy, but that's part of the process, because that's one of the biggest assets for libraries, is that we have people coming in every day. It is super quick and easy to test stuff right there and right then with someone who has an opinion. We use it quite heavily on developing services. We've used it heavily when we developed Doc 1. Right now we're building a new library in one of our suburbs, where some of these images are from, where we use these design thinking tools to create the spaces and the services. So we also, as I said, we turn it into a service, which is what we are doing, providing these services and training for both kids, young people, and adults. So my claim is that traditionally, citizen involvement and user engagement was something that city governments or councils would use because they had to. It was dull. It would be the same people coming. It would be about information. So what we've been trying to do is to move this cooperation up on the participation ladder into where we actually delegate power to citizens and perform real partnerships with the citizens. So when we talk about the library as a democratic space, we stand heavily upon our library legislation in Denmark. So in our library legislation, it says that we have to provide free and equal access to enlightenment, learning, and cultural activities. So that legislation was created for the first time because Denmark wanted to support a new democracy coming up. So the public library was fostered out of that intention, and that's what we need to make sure that we honor still. So, but when I talk about democracy and democratic space, I'm not talking about a political system. I'm not talking about taking a political standpoint in a library. I'm talking about participatory democracy. I'm talking about the library as a space for participation and for dialogue. And that is what libraries are extremely good at doing. And we've seen throughout the past year, where we've been sitting at home distant, that the spaces where we have the conversations, the town square has been missing. we've been distant from each other. We've been going down our own path, and we have perhaps not been having these conversations about the life that we lead together in a safe space. And we had a democracy commission in Denmark trying to figure out how how democracy is under threat. And what they pointed out is that these 4 points are the most important things for democracy: representation, democratic dialogue, participatory democracy, and societal decisions through citizens' engagements. These are all of them what we can do and provide and be part of as libraries, because we are a core institution. We have the space that can be that community driver, and we know that people feel safe and they trust the libraries. Some countries, they've actually managed to write that into their library legislation. In Norway, in Iceland, in Finland. We're not quite there yet, but we're just doing it anyway. So we're not really that bothered. Don't tell anyone I said that. So what we're looking at is, when we talk about participation culture being a key component, in DOC1, in our public libraries, we've had decades of user involvement. We've had decades of working on how to make the library as a community hub. So it is a key component for this, the participatory competences, which that is, and literacy is an enormous amount of this. So we need facilitation of the conversation. That's what libraries can do. We have a high ranking credibility. We need local partnerships to have a strong democracy. We work with partnerships, as I showed you, heavily on in creating activities and service. And finally, the inclusive spaces. Again, I'm coming back to the spaces because they're incredibly important. Spaces for participation and engagement. That is the democratic infrastructure that we have as libraries, not just in Aarhus, not just in Denmark, in UK and across the world. And I'll flip through 100 pictures in no time. I can see Ivan becoming a little bit worried about time. So just my point is that when we talk about these democratic spaces, obviously we need to create spaces that can shift form and atmosphere according to what we put into it. That's what we call unprogrammed spaces. This is a major big staircase in the middle of our library in DOC1, which is unprogrammed, but as you can see, it can be programmed in 1,000 different ways according to what happens at that particular time and who is doing something in it. And that's part of the democratic aspect and the participation. Also, our outside spaces we need to remember, because they're extremely important, and we need to make sure that they can be used for different purposes that people have the urge to use them for. So, as I said, the library in Aarhus, the DOC1, looks very different from day to day. Very often stuff spread all over. A lot of people doing a lot of different kind of stuff, but also it's about meetings and it's about intimacy and relations, which is something that we're heavily working with and will be so even more after now that we open up. But also we want to make sure, and I think that's important, that you hear the sound of people. The sound of people is essential. To be together with someone without being together is an incredibly important part of being a human being. So the sound of people is cherished, being music, being loudness, being play, user-driven activities, people coming in, creating services for each other, performing, playing, often noisy, which is part of the intention, or just using the spaces for their own purposes as they feel like it. Because they own it. That's the whole point. We don't own that space. In fact, I couldn't help myself by showing you this gong, because that's part of the what I call the democratic infrastructure. Is that this is the gong? It's part of our art. It's a huge tubular bell made in bronze, and it connected to the maternity ward in Aarhus. So if you give birth to a child, there is a big button you can ring, and then it gives a gong in the library. And the wonderful thing about this is it brings us together, and it is a shout out. if you know what it is, you look up, you raise your gaze, and you look around, and you maybe think about something beautiful that happened, or you remember when you gave birth, or something else, or you realize we just got one more in Aarhus. If you don't know what it is, that's also interesting, because people still look up, and then they acknowledge that there are other people around you, and then they go back to whatever it is that they do. So it is a connector for all of us. Right. So my whole point is that the library is a space where we need to create meaning together, because if we don't do that, it is just an empty shell. This is part of being a democratic infrastructure. This is about being a democratic space, and this is the town square that we need to be. Right, that was, I hope not too, it seemed like I was fitting into the time. So anyway, so I want to thank you guys for listening and having patience with all these many pictures that I wanted to flip through. And I want to invite Neil back on the floor.
Hi there, is my presentation showing?
Yes, but in work mode.
Bear with me. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yay.
Perfect.
Thanks, Marie. And I never get tired of hearing the story or seeing the images. And the gong is possibly one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in a library in my entire life. And that little red seat next to it, that's where I sit. So fantastic. I'm just going to whistle. I'm just going to go through this quite quickly. I mean, we've mentioned before in a lot of the elements of the introduction that Manchester really is a library city. And one of my favourite things in a recent guide to the city was there were 10 reasons why Manchester is the UK's new cultural hotspot. And at number 4, because it's home to some of the best libraries. So to get libraries in the top 10 as to why to visit a city, it's pretty good by my understanding. Bit of context, and like Marie said, people sometimes forget that we're part of an infrastructure. So in Manchester, we have the Central Library, a number of neighbourhood libraries, a number of community libraries. We also manage the prison library, the county record office and the archives, and we've got a housebound library service, and we're part of the wider Greater Manchester Libraries Partnership. We have a library strategy that started in 2005, and since then 70% of the libraries in the city have either been rebuilt, refurbished, relocated, with £80 million investment in the library estate. And currently we only have 5 standalone libraries remaining, and that's for now. Recently invested 2.1 million in our IT infrastructure, and we have a key estate strategic partners, which include leisure services, adult education, further education colleges, high schools and academies, housing providers, and health. We undertook quite a strong communication strategy, both internal and external branding, and we have a widening access and participation board working with partners across the city to try and get more people into our libraries to engage in the range of services. And I just love that idea of the library mashup, Marie, so that's what I'm stealing from today. We have targeted programming as well. So in some of our libraries on a Friday evening and Saturday evening, they're only open for young people and no one else. And we're developing a core offer and local library development plans. So this is Manchester Central Library, 1934. Contrary to popular belief, I wasn't there at the opening, but that's the day that the King and Queen opened the library, and the library was absolutely surrounded by thousands and thousands of Mancunians proud to see their new civic space open. Every child in the city was given a handkerchief to celebrate the opening of the library in 1934, and I cannot explain how many of them we have in the vaults of the library. Our transformation journey started in 2005 with an initial feasibility study. We had a heritage audit, we had a small fire in 2007, and then we were granted funding in 2008 that led to the rebirth of the library in 2014. The library is now also home to the Lord Mayor, so we are the civic and ceremonial home of the city. And in 2019, we introduced a museum residency, so a space in the library that small museums in the city can use to showcase their works. So why did we want to change the library concept? We wanted an original modern library. Previously, only 70% of the space was accessible to the public, and now we've reversed that. So 70% is actually open to people to explore and discover. We want to develop some new services, new audiences. We wanted to ensure our commitment to special collections, and we wanted to create a one integrated archive centre of excellence and create a new city centre lending library as well. When I moved to Manchester a number of years ago, we had a very small city centre population. We now have 100,000 people living in the city centre alone. I wanted to develop the idea of the library as the third place, the city's living room, the city's study, the treasure trove, create it as a cultural destination and ensure that we have a core exhibition programme. And prior to COVID, there were 5 exhibitions on display at any one time in the library. So it's similar to Marie, we wanted the library to be a place to meet, learn, share, explore, a trusted place to spend time, and engage with communities from all backgrounds and all ages. Looking at our target audiences, our schools, our young people's families, our BAME communities, our place-based communities, communities of interest, and also our heritage tourists. And we're quite an ambitious target where we're looking to create 2 million visits per year. That's roughly 8,000 per day. As part of our new audience and community engagement, we've looked at youth volunteering. We have a core volunteer offer. We have a library lovers scheme. We've been taking our collections out on tour, so some of our rare and historic items out into local communities. And the library's now become, pre-COVID, a core item on schools for school visits. And we've introduced a range of family-friendly events through our Sunday Fundays, where the library's open 4 or 5 Sundays per year for a family audience. So as part of the design, we wanted to respect what we have, and that's the fantastic reading room, but then also create some new amazing spaces, and that's the Archive Plus exhibition area. Creating a new vertical circulation core to get people round the building. Previously, I think we had the smallest lift in the Western Hemisphere. And then finally, 5-year anniversary, we reached our 2 million visitor target. So success, we said exactly what we would do on the tin. Thank you.
Right, thank you both for your presentations. I'll be joining, I'm here now. Thank you so much for that. I think it worked really well. That's not just the relationship between Manchester and Aarhus, but the relationship between the journeys that you've both been on and the development of those spaces. We have got some questions, and also you're not just on time, I think we're a little ahead of time. So thank you both, fantastic. I could see there was a lot of reaction to that tubular bell. Again, I think what is just a potent symbol, and again, as some people commented in the chat, a great piece of public art, beautiful idea, but a way of showing what libraries can be, and that idea of connector. So I've got a couple of questions from some of our delegates. These ones, actually, if I ask them both in turn, so if I ask for you first, Marie, and then Neil, and they came in mainly when Marie was talking, but it'd be great if you could talk, is the space in the library ever paid for in Dock 1 and then in Central Library? And if it is, does that jeopardise the idea of the library as a free and democratic space? And the converse of that is, if you're not charging, don't you get overwhelmed by demand?
Yeah, so basically we don't charge. The thing is, we don't have to make money on the spaces. We do charge if, for instance, a private company wants to use one of our auditoriums, but we actually have a prioritized list saying they are very on the bottom of the list. So if a user group or an association wants to use it, they use it for free and they come first in the queue. So the whole point is to make sure that our spaces, our meeting rooms, our auditoriums can be used by groups from the community, or also national groups, or it might even be a group coming from Manchester, for things that relates to the library. And yes, we do get overwhelmed once in a while. And what we've tried to do is to divide it into two. So we as you might have seen on the pictures, Dock 1 is mainly one big open space. And that's part of the whole idea of this town square with a roof on it, that it's open and you see each other. So we said these open spaces, you can't book them. You can agree with us that you're going to come in and do different kinds of services that you do, but you can't just book them online. Whereas the meeting rooms and the auditoriums, you can book online, and there is just a booking system and with this prioritized schedule. So it's a way of us also to make sure that what people are stumbling upon when they come into the open library space is something that is aligned with the identity of Dock 1 and with the themes that we want to bring forward, but also maybe with some of the initiatives that we're having this particular month or this particular year. So that's a way of juggling it.
Okay. And Neil, similar?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of our events are free. That's what we intend to do. Occasionally, though, there will be a ticketed price potentially if it's something that we've bought in to then sell, and then we can control access to activity as well. We do let some of our spaces out occasionally, but very similar to the approach that Marie's talking about. What we're trying to do is programme the library and ensure that we have a range of events. When there's a festival in the city, we try and engage with every festival, be it the City of Literature, be it the Literature Festival, the Jazz Festival, the International Festival, and so on and so forth. And we wouldn't charge those organisations to use the space, because that's what gets our audiences through the door.
Okay, thank you. And start with Neil. Question came in just to say, and you both use this phrase, but somebody asked particularly when you used it, Neil, about third space, sorry. So could you just expand a bit on what you mean by third space?
I hope Marie and I are going to agree on this, but I mean, for me, it's not the place where you live, and it's not the place where you work. It's that other place in your life that you can go to that's free of charge. And I think Marie summed it up beautifully in relation to, you know, that town square idea, that concept, where people of all ages, of all educational backgrounds, you know, every demographic in the city can come into that library without anyone asking them why they're there.
And can I contribute to that? Yes, I totally agree, Neil. And that is, and it has been for a long time a thing that libraries are trying to achieve, to be that place that you choose the liberty to go to without having to, because you have to go to school, you have to go to work, or at least some of us do. But this is a place where you choose to go and you don't necessarily have a particular thing that you have to do. But the thing is, what we also have been looking at is that for other people, for some people, this is actually their first space or their second space, because there are also a lot of people coming in to work there. There's also a lot of people who, well, they don't live there, but nearly. We have people who come in the morning and they stay there all day until we close because they don't have anywhere else to go. So all of a sudden it becomes both the first, second, and third space, which is interesting. And it's interesting how to merge these domains together. And I think that's something that libraries need to look into.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Jeff. And this was, if we start with Marie, it was in response to your presentation, but particularly around design thinking, co-creation. And I suppose is that used also as a way of engaging non-users of the library? And if you could tell us a bit more about how that might work and any examples?
Yes, heavily, and it's that's a very good question. Thank you. Yes, it definitely is, because the whole point is actually for us to become wiser on a topic. It's not necessarily about interviewing people who already go to the library. It's very often about interviewing people who might not use the library, or who are against libraries, or who just for some reason are interesting in their knowledge about a specific topic. So what we always try to do is to actually also visit people in their own homes, which are not necessarily library users or upfront. We had a project called Non-Readers for a couple of years, where we were trying to figure out what is it that makes people stop reading at a certain point in their lives, and not necessarily because they're dyslexic or but some people just stop reading. And in order to and very often we don't see them in the library, right? Because why? if you have an old-fashioned approach to what a library is, and you didn't see a library before, after you left school, you will still think libraries are about books, right? So you won't show up. So we reached out, had interviews with a lot of different kinds of user groups that we connected to through our networks that don't necessarily use the library, to figure out what are the obstacles, what are the barriers, what is it that people, what are the mindsets, and how can we change our physical premises and our services to provide better services and be more approachable for these groups of people. So that was a concrete project where we used it, but that is normally the method that we use.
That's great, thank you. And Neil, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example I can give is when we were designing what Archives Plus was to be. So Archives, you know, the dedicated archive user would find the archive search room wherever you put it. And what the whole purpose of Archives Plus was to engage with new audiences and introduce young people into the history of their city. So we did a lot of work, consultation work out in the Moss Side area of the city with that community there, to ask them what did they want to find out about, what did they want to know, what would interest them, how could they contribute to it. And there's a phrase that I stole from Nina Simone, who was the director of Santa Cruz Museum, where she talked about how it should be it used to be the library for the people, now it's the library of the people.
Fantastic. And another question on co-creation, I suppose, is how much you might use that process, if you like, back of house. So again, do you think about, you know, acquisition, inquiry services, staff training in the same way? Or is this very much about your public programs?
If you're asking about the co-creation process and methods, this is very much back of house as well. So just to give you an example, on last Monday, we had an entire day for, I think we were 50 people, 50 staff in 3 groups running around the city, discovering undiscovered spaces and services and new ideas, or simply going into the woods, being handed 3 words and then contemplating for 10 minutes and just by yourself looking up in the sky. So we're trying to use a lot of these tools and also the inspirational tools for ourselves, because we know it creates better cooperation amongst ourselves, but it also gives us a mindset that makes us want to reach out of the library, out to other partners, out of the country. One of the reasons that we're working with Neil and his great people is because of that mindset. So no, very much also internally.
Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that, I mean, I think we were on that journey, and 2 years ago, we got permission to close every library down for 2 days so that we could bring all the staff together for a conference, because the majority of the staff are frontline staff, and, you know, it's really hard to get them together to actually share ideas and contributions. And one of the things that one of the team came up with, which I thought was genius, was each of the 22 libraries was given basically an A2 board and asked to populate that with the best things that were happening in their library. And we then set that up as an exhibition. So 22 easels, and every member of the staff was able to walk around and just steal ideas. The best thing about libraries is you can steal ideas. And that was really, really helpful. We've had a further seminar, starting to do library development plans in individual branch libraries with the staff. So I mean, we're on that journey, and hopefully when we get back into the next normal, we can pick that up and continue.
And I think that what you're saying, Neil, is a beautiful example of that. What I was trying to point out earlier, that this is not about tools. This is about a mindset. It's really about how we view the world and how we view each other. And it doesn't matter whether it's citizens or community partners or colleagues. It is really about a curiosity and a desire to engage, and that comes in many different shapes or formats. But it also demands of us to be to give the time for that, and also to be ready to jump into it, because that's also can also be challenging, for some people.
And I was going to comment that I took that from both your presentations, that you know, somebody just seeing the headlines or seeing the title might think this is about the transformation of large buildings, full stop, but it's not, is it, at all? It's much more about that cultural shift, the positioning, the strategy behind it, and as you say, the mindset. So I think there's a lot there that people can take away to think about that in their own contexts. And also, I was very struck, you talked about this very, Marie, about the infrastructure and how all the libraries interact and think of the service. And I know, having seen Neil talk about this elsewhere, it's exactly the same in Manchester, that all those libraries are linked. So thinking of that as an infrastructure is a really potent way as well. And can I ask a final question, Marie? I mean, in the UK, you know, since 2010, we're in a period of austerity in terms of, so central government is squeezing public funding. You know, we have had 800 libraries close due to those impacts. So, and you can see, you know, I hope that the delegates can see in the way that Manchester has addressed that through some of the co-location strategies and the refurbishment of properties. I was interested about the political backdrop that you're working in, both nationally and within the municipality. Yeah, if you could just say a few words about that.
Sure. So in Denmark, public libraries are funded by the local government, so by the city, by tax money. We do have a national legislation that basically says what I shared, and also says that every municipality has to have a sufficient library service, and that can of course be interpreted in many different ways, just like it has been, not to the extent that has been interpreted in England, but anyway, so we are very much dependent on advocating towards our city council, our city politicians, but more importantly towards especially the local community and the partners in the community, because we found throughout the years, and even I mean, Doc 1 would not be there if we had not spent a lot of time reaching out to the different partners in the city, also the more formalized one like the university or the School of Architecture or etc. So that carries a lot of weight in our advocacy efforts, and that's something that I always admired Neil for doing as well, because I know that's one of and I'm saying that so you don't have to, Neil. This is actually one of the things where Neil is like world champion, and I think that is so important. And we know that we all know that local politicians are very much listening to what citizens are saying in the city, and that is where we are directing our advocacy efforts, if that was what you were asking.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much, both. We've come to the end of time. There was a question I didn't get to, so apologies to the person who asked that. Can I just thank you again, both, for your time this morning. We did want, you know, to energize and uplift people, and that was really inspiring to hear about the work that you're doing. So more strength to both your arms as you continue. Thank you so much. For delegates, we're going to take an 8-minute break now and be back at 11 a.m. when we'll hear from Nick Poole, Chief Executive of CILIP. So we're going to play a couple more. If you, I do take a break from the screen, grab yourself a tea and coffee. I would urge you stay away from work email. Try and stay focused on today, just have a proper break. But if you do want to stay, we'll be playing a couple more films showing the guided tours of Manchester libraries by Rosie Garland. So I'll see you back here at 11 a.m.
So here we are in Manchester's noisy and vibrant centre outside the John Rylands Library. It was designed and built by his wife Enriqueta Rylands, who wanted to use her inheritance of millions to build a library for the people of Manchester. And she didn't just build it anywhere. She built it in one of the poorest parts of Manchester because she didn't see why the poor should be denied beauty and education. It's now part of the University of Manchester. Shall us go inside? And here we are in the amazing historic reading room. It is the centrepiece of the Rylands, and there are hundreds of marvellous things we could show you, but let's start here. And if you think it looks like a cathedral, you'd be right, because it was built and designed by Enriqueta Rylands as a cathedral to knowledge. Every inch of the Rylands Library is intricate with beautiful detail, from the leaded windows to the radiator covers to the lights. The Rylands was one of the first places in Manchester to be opened completely with electrical light, which was a marvel in 1900. And they're sculpted in the shape of cotton flowers to remind us about where the money came from to build the Rylands, which was from John Ryland's cotton money. And look up. When you come into the Rylands, remember to look up. If you look up, there are dragons to be found. One of the many things it's worth knowing about Enriqueta Rylands is that she took an interest in every detail of the library, including the chairs. So these are all the prototype chairs that didn't make it. This one was too small, this one was too large, maybe that one at the end was just right. So yes, Mrs. Rylands was also the Goldilocks of chairs. And one of the most exciting things is to be able to take you behind the scenes in the John Rylands Library. And this is the mezzanine. And listen to that. Here we are in the heart of busy, noisy Manchester. And it's a reminder that the Rylands is here for you to be a place in which to be calm, in which to find some peace in the heart of the city, a place just to be. Welcome to Manchester Central Library, and for 2 years it's been the UK's most visited public library. So let's visit. And here we are at the fabulous Shakespeare Window, absolutely beautiful. And maybe you can spot which play is which. And it's worth remembering that Shakespeare was a regular schoolboy. He was one of the people. And that links beautifully to the fact that Central Library in Manchester is the people's library. So come on in when you can, get a book and settle down into the people's sitting room. We're now outside the amazing reading room. It is a sanctuary, a quiet place if you want to come and do some quiet work. Interesting fact, which you may not know, is that if the reading room was completely filled with beer, it would be 14.6 million pints. There's something to impress your friends. You've seen the inside of the reading room dome, and now you're seeing the outside, and the fact that Manchester Central Library is essentially built in a round, and it was based on the Pantheon in Rome. So that's another question anytime anyone asks you, what have the Romans ever done for us? And this isn't just for decoration. In Manchester Central Library, you can come and borrow instruments and jam in the library. It just keeps getting more marvellous, doesn't it, really? This is one of my favourite places in Manchester Central Library, the historic stacks behind the scenes, and been here since the library was built in 1934. And in here you're going to find all kinds of strange books like the Tailor and Cutter Journal, the Gas Journal, the Cabinet Maker Journal, all kinds of unique and wonderful books. Thank you so much for joining us at Manchester Central Library.
Hello everybody, welcome back. When we originally conceived this event, we hoped we were coming to the end of the pandemic, and we were looking at a small event for about 40 or 50 people to be held in Central Library in Manchester, and we had the ambition to bring a small number of international delegates as well as Greater Manchester librarians together, as part of those 2 days spent together, as well as exchanging ideas, you'd also be able to walk the city. You'd be able to visit some of the libraries. You'd be able to visit the rest of the Festival of Libraries. Obviously, the pandemic continues and we can't do that. So as a way of trying to share some of that, we're sharing these films with you. I hope for this audience, I don't need to apologise for sharing films about libraries, and we'll continue to do through during the day. It's interesting, we conceived today as well looking about the future of libraries, but again a lot of the speakers have already have pointed out that actually there isn't necessarily a new normal, there is just normal, and this is how we're dealing with it. So our next speaker, who's going to look at the topic, is Nick Poole, Chief Executive of CILIP, Chartered Institute of Library and Informational Professionals. Really delighted that Nick can join us, and I'm going to hand over to him now. And there will be questions at the end, so please use the Q&A function to post any questions for Nick. Thank you very much, Nick.
Amazing. Good morning, Ivan. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. How on earth are you meant to follow a video like that? I have absolutely no idea. So thank you so much for putting me on immediately after that. I'm also gutted not to be in Manchester. Personally, it is a fantastic city that I miss dearly. So hopefully we'll get a chance to meet again in the city and enjoy those magnificent libraries before too long. I've also always believed that a sector like libraries needs a festival. So I'm so glad we finally have one. And I hope that this is the beginning of something really exciting, because if ever anything deserved to be celebrated, it was our fantastic library community. So I'm going to talk today, really sort of continuing a lot of the themes that Marie and Neil sort of opened up for us already, on the subject of Only Connect. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, those of you that think I'm going to talk about a popular quiz show, but actually I'm going to talk about libraries fundamentally as places of connection, what that's meant for us over the last year or so, and what I think that means for us as we look ahead. But I thought I'd start. It's always tricky to start a presentation by quoting somebody much better at public speaking than I am. But there was an amazing talk given by Dr. John Scally, who, as many of you will know, is stepping down as Director of National Library of Scotland, Chief Librarian of National Library of Scotland. And he gave a sort of a valedictory address drawing on not just his experience in libraries, but the first concert he ever went to, which was the Skids, his first job, which was as a cleaner in the Netherlands, and drawing on all that sort of insight and experience of that amazing career. He said this: when you're facing new challenges, restate your core purpose, restate the role of libraries as a place of reading, of knowledge, of learning, as a place for a community of readers, a place to be safe or simply to be. And he had a brilliant subtitle as well for his talk, which was Transformation Pa. What he was saying was actually what we talk about with libraries is always a process of ongoing evolution, of kind of learning and discovering and adapting what we do, which is why my other second favorite quote, which I wanted to share by way of opening this morning, was this one, which I think Neil MacInnes actually said to me first of all, but from Rolf Halpel, Professor of Library Practice at the University of Washington, who said the library was never finished because it was never meant to be finished. Wonderfully and brilliantly, a library is never a fixed point. As we've seen in those videos, they evolve and adapt and change to be whatever they need to be. And so the pandemic is just another thing that we're evolving and adapting to address. It's another experience in the lives of our users that we have to be there to make sure that we are meaningful and relevant and free in the way we have been throughout the amazing history of this sector. So a lot of the themes we're talking about are about connection. And I think today's event, yesterday's discussions, are a fantastic opportunity to center on that idea of connection. So as we look, I think, not to life beyond the pandemic, but life with the pandemic, or certainly coming to terms with the pandemic, we think that some of these principles should be absolutely essential in our sector conversations. So connecting with ourselves first and foremost in our own experiences this year. Everybody's got a story, everybody's got pain to share, an experience of the past year. It's been a huge disruptive moment in all of our lives, some to a far more tragic extent than others. And it is, I think, really important that we acknowledge our own humanity and our own limitations, our own expectations of ourselves, so that there isn't an urgent pressure to build back better. I'm not going to use many of those phrases today, I promise, at the expense of people's happiness and well-being. I think it's really important that we connect with our colleagues, that we do what we're doing here with the festival, sharing stories, empathizing, sharing experiences, bringing people gradually back together. Certainly for Silip, our first moment of reconnection, we're going to have a big picnic for our team and bring everybody back together in a park where people feel safe and just talk about the organization and what everybody's been through. I think one of the things that's been really salutary for us as a professional body over the last year and a half is connecting with the professional community. You know, none of us is an island, no sector is an island. You know, the challenges facing school libraries are very much those in universities, the same in health, in business, in public libraries. There is so much strength we can derive from sharing solidarity with one another as we are today as a professional community. I think the immense power of libraries to me has always been the fact that they are a platform that exists to respond to their users. You know, there aren't many other things in the world, as we heard in one of the films earlier, that are designed around you and what you need rather than how much you have to spend or where you live. And so I think there is an opportunity to understand the changes going on in our users' lives. There's a chance for us to go back to core principles and connect with our purpose and identity as libraries. You know, a lot of those Enlightenment values that gave rise to that, you know, that cathedral of knowledge, as they said in the film, are so vital today, are so essential, that if we're going to be the kind of society I think we want to be, then we have a job to do to empower everybody with information or through information and reading, no matter where they live or what their means. It was great to hear Marie talking about the role of partnership in their work at Doc One. I think we have already seen a real coming together of organizations and groups that share our values and our ambitions and our belief in the rights of the individual. I think we have new ways to connect with users. We've all learned, I think, through the digital pivot that there are new opportunities, new tools in our armory to reach out and engage with users. And similarly, the whole experience of the pandemic has been a profound moment of connection with decision makers. I can't tell you how many people in political and public life have come to me and talked about their renewed understanding of the power of libraries and librarians as a platform and as an infrastructure, not just for learning, but for civic life, for people to be engaged in the life of their communities. So I think we are going through a powerful moment of reconnection. And I thought it might be useful. I mean, I would love to hear from you what you've taken from the last year. I'd certainly like to share some of the things that have been shared with me and with us at CILIP in terms of lessons we learned and insights we've taken. The first, though, and it, you know, everybody loves that bell in Doc 1 because it is so human. And I think one of the most powerful propositions for me working in libraries is that we are fundamentally and brilliantly human organizations. And so, you know, you see it in migrant communities, you saw it in the jungle in Calais, you see it in protest groups, wherever human beings come together throughout history, you find something like a library. And I think that connection to that essential nature of libraries as a human service is really important. And I think if there's something that's shone through for me in the last 15 months, it's that empathy. And I say this knowing that today is Empathy Day, you know, that humanity and kindness of librarians has shone through. And if we needed data to back up that proposition, the Carnegie UK Trust and their amazing public libraries during lockdown figures just provided some really solid evidence. You know, people look to their library for information, for a positive impact on well-being, that it kept them connected in an age of loneliness and social isolation. It allowed them to develop a hobby. I don't know which of us didn't start a new hobby in lockdown 1 that perhaps isn't still quite as active as it was back then. And then just helping people, being relevant and present in people's lives. And attached to that, there's some really, really interesting research done by our colleague, Dr. Andrew Cox at the University of Sheffield. He's in the iSchool there, who's looked at the roles that university libraries played during the pandemic. And he came up with this really interesting integrated model that essentially said, you know, the role of the university library moved away from supporting students with library-specific issues to a much broader sense or understanding really of the role of the library in student well-being, in promoting mental health as part of a sort of whole university approach. So the model he developed, I think, is really powerful for all of us in all parts of the library sector, that there's a key focus on our own well-being as staff, on the inherent value of having a library in a place. We must never, ever underestimate that. And then the role of library as good partner, that we can do extraordinary things in terms of reaching users and making a real impact in people's lives. And then these quite specific roles around the library, understanding what's going on in people's lives, you know, so seeing where they're at, what they're going through, signposting issues, hosting debate, discussion and dialogue, detecting problems as they emerge and being able to organize information and resources to support students. The idea that well-being isn't a project or necessarily even a reading list, it's an intrinsic outcome of a library service. It's one of the things we are for, is to make people feel well and connected and better able to cope with the things that are happening in their lives. And then obviously all of the much broader impact of library services in terms of access to knowledge and supporting and underpinning critical teaching and learning. But I think, you know, when Marie referred to the mashup earlier, it is really hard to overstate quite how powerful that is as a platform, particularly in a time of public health crisis and social change. And so I think what we've partly done is really understood quite the role that we occupy in people's lives and what that means for us going forward. It's also, and I think we're all very aware of this, but certainly at CILIP we believe this very fundamentally, social justice is a library issue. Libraries are unequivocally a social justice issue, and COVID has undoubtedly exposed the existing deep inequality in our society. So some of the figures are pretty startling. Mortality rates in the 20 most deprived local authorities, more than twice those in the wealthiest areas. It's always been true that poverty kills, but never more so in a public health crisis. Universal credit claimant numbers have increased more than 8%. compared with in deprived areas compared with wealthier ones. Deaths from COVID-19 amongst people from ethnic minority groups were between 2 and 4 times higher than those for the white population in England. There's also some very stark evidence emerging around mortality rates for people with experience of disabilities. And 1 in 3 young people aged between 18 to 24 were either furloughed or lost their jobs during this pandemic, which is twice the rate of the overall adult population. And so we have, as I think, ethical information professionals, librarians, library workers, whichever kind of sobriquet you want to operate under, we cannot spectate those figures. We have to change them. And so we have to organize ourselves to create a platform which helps create a more just society where these factors, poverty, being from a minority ethnic group, having a disability, being from a younger age group, give you a structural disadvantage that in extremis leads to loss of life. And so we have to organize ourselves to address those fault lines that exist in our society. And I think, you know, we've learned a lot through this pandemic about the mechanics of health inequality. You know, we know there were fundamental pre-existing causes which are around the wider global economic environment, political priorities and decisions, what gets funded, what gets defunded over the preceding 10 or 20 years. And then, you know, the fact that the UK is one of the most unequal societies in the G7 in terms of income inequality, which therefore leads into health inequality, that then has an impact on people's work, on their leisure time, on the services they have access to and use. And we aren't going to be able to solve that problem alone, but we have to join forces with everybody that is committed to addressing that problem, because, you know, it's been exposed by the pandemic, but health inequality exists at every level in our society and blights too many of our users' lives. I think as well, you know, we've seen throughout this, I didn't directly quote Donald Trump telling people to drink bleach to cure themselves with coronavirus, but the fact that the World Health Organization had to issue a warning saying that drinking methanol, ethanol or bleach doesn't prevent or cure COVID-19 is pretty indicative of what the Secretary General of the UN said. We're facing something that is as much an infodemic of misinformation as it is a public health crisis. And I think one of the most compelling things for me is seeing, you know, from health to HE, businesses, school librarians in public libraries stepping up to be sources of trustworthy information. And I hope we've sort of put a bullet in the brain of the idea that we're neutral. I don't think anything is neutral, but we can be credible and accountable and transparent in the information we share. We can absolutely be part of the fight back against structured misinformation, the state use of misinformation, by helping our users be more savvy, more media and information literate. I think we've also learned, you know, I think there was a brief concern that some councils were going to say, well, you've done such an amazing job with your digital pivot, why do you need these you know, buildings on the high street? And thankfully that seems to have really subsided now as the pandemic really heightens our awareness of the importance of the physical, you know, proximity, how we manage our spaces, even how we move air through our buildings. And I think we do really have a job to do in the coming months in helping people come back together, helping them feel safe. Everybody is somewhere different along the spectrum of safety and risk, and we have to engender confidence and trust in the way that we always have in our spaces, and then be there to support new working practices. You know, we're hearing a lot. I was talking to a group of executives from Costa Coffee the other day who think that people won't necessarily be working at home, they won't necessarily be working at the office, but they will be looking for neighborhood workspace. And if there were ever a beautiful definition of a library as a place of learning and work, I can't imagine a better one. And so exploring, as we look ahead, the role of libraries as places of meaning, places of connection, social workspace, the new office between home and work, and spaces, as I think, to be honest, we always have been, but spaces for creativity and imagination. I've always thought a library is as good a place to write a book as it is to read one. And, you know, I think in some ways we undervalue the creative output of what goes on inside the walls of the organisations we're all working in and supporting. So we learnt as well, not everyone is online. You know, I think the massive digital exclusion gap around school-age kids, you know, who has a device, who doesn't, who has a kitchen table they can work at, who doesn't, who has reliable Wi-Fi, who's sat there trying to kind of nick it from next door. You know, the fact that we have been successful in putting content online doesn't mean that we've changed the underlying fault lines in terms of digital exclusion and information poverty. So, you know, going into this, the ONS data in 2018, 51% of households on low incomes, so 6,000 to 10,000, had home internet access, compared with nearly 100% of households with an income over over 40K. And that's a massive issue for us. You know, if we're going to try and build a more equitable society, if we're going to do our job as information professionals, then we have to take targeted action to overcome this widening digital divide that is as much a facet of inequality and income inequality as it is of anything else. We also know this, I mean, I would say this here, wouldn't I? But, you know, it's been amazing, I think, through such a challenging year and a half to hear the stories, just the very simple stories of people who have, I want to say gone above and beyond, but that sounds exploitative, but who've shown genuine love and care for the people that you're serving. So every sector I talk to has a story to tell of how people supported their users, the extraordinary figures, you know, the work that you did across Manchester, whether that was in the digital pivot, helping people find e-content, you know, astonishing work by healthcare librarians, setting up the new Nightingale hospitals, providing the evidence base that enabled us to get to the response that we have now. Reaching out to users, imaginative programming, baby bump, rhyme time, you know, the whole kind of panoply of library activities. And you did that, and that's incredible. You know, the fact that as an advocate for libraries, all I have to do is dip into a pot of stories and I come out with the richest narrative about who we are as a profession and the difference that we make as a group of people. And I think as well, this, you know, very early in the days of I think it's the first lockdown, we launched the National Shelf Service as a daily YouTube channel of book recommendations for readers. And we just saw this incredible flowering of readership and interest in books and reading. And so, you know, in much the same way as we heard about in World War II, that immense kind of flowering of readership we have absolutely seen again. But I think, you know, we were all disappointed by announcements in recent weeks around the intention around literacy recovery. We must not have a lost generation. It must not be acceptable that a generation of kids come through that haven't been exposed to reading literacy ideas, you know, and so while I hope there will be an improvement in that national policy picture, we have to put our shoulder to the wheel as a profession and say that, you know, through things like the brilliant Reading Agency, Summer of Reading, initiatives around readership and reader development, let's really harness and build on that passion to make sure that those skills reach every corner of the communities that we're serving. So I think, you know, learning on all of that, and again, I'd really love to hear the lessons that you've taken from it. As we come to terms with this pandemic, I think we've seen that our professional community, libraries, learning resource centres, information services, whatever you want to call them, are more vital, more vibrant, more needed than ever before. I think we have really, to coin a phrase, found our identity and our mojo over the last year and a half, despite the immense challenges that people have faced individually and personally. And we have to harness that moment. I think, as everybody said on this already, it's way too early to call what the new normal is going to be all about. There's a 3-stage kind of response model, which says you have the crisis, then you have recovery, and then you have renewal. I honestly don't think we're out of the crisis yet. So I don't think the process of recovery has fully begun. And I think there'll probably be a period where people want to go back to the old ways, certainly back to festivals and being outside, before we see really transformative themes emerging. But I think there are some landmarks we can see on the road ahead that are going to be very significant for us and our libraries. So I just wanted to share in the next couple of slides just some thoughts about what those might be. And the first one is this, and people who've seen me kind of speak before will know this is a bit of a passionate hobby horse of mine. Most of the challenges we face today were obvious in the demographic data of 40 years ago. You know, the issues around income inequality, an aging population, you know, whether we were building enough housing and infrastructure and libraries, that was all in the data. And I am really keen that we don't make that same mistake again. And so it's useful, I think, to look at what the data is telling us sort of post-pandemic about what that picture looks like. So we know from the ONS data there's going to be more people. We know the UK population is set to grow by around 3 million people in the next 10 years. It will surpass 70 million people by 2031. So we're going to have more people. It's also going to be an older population. So the proportion of our population aged 85 years and older will more than double in the next 25 years. And we know that from the demographic data and the kind of population curve as it's moving through now. We also know we'll be more diverse. By 2031, people from minority ethnic groups will make up 15% of the population, which will have roughly doubled since 2005, 2006. And we know we're going to be more urban. We're going to be living in cities. So by 2036, it's predicted that up to 64% of the UK population will live in larger cities. We'll continue to see urban-rural sprawl, but we're looking at an increase in the urban population of 17 to 18%. So the question is, you know, there's going to be more of us. We're going to be living and working for longer and learning for longer. There's going to be a greater diversity in who we are. So how do we get ready? How do we make sure that we as, you know, infrastructure for knowledge and learning are ready for those changes? And I think that idea of infrastructure, I think it was Marie talked about infrastructure for learning, you know, with more people across all demographics, people learning for longer, more population density, more economic pressure, let's face it, on public services. What we ought to be doing as a matter of national policy right now is building libraries to keep pace with future demand. So what really pains me when I look at local consultations about library services is that they're strategizing for today, and they're failing even to do that in many cases, whereas we should be strategizing for new communities, new populations, new building, new town centres emerging across the UK. Because libraries and information services in all sectors are the best physical and digital infrastructure we have for broad and universal access to knowledge, skills and learning outside the classroom. We are the best way our society has of informing and equipping itself for the future. And so we must build more libraries. And that's the message we're taking forward, you know, into governments in all 4 nations as we look ahead to the next couple of years. Because of this as well, you know, rather than thinking about, I know we sometimes talk about, well, I'm a school librarian, I'm a public librarian, you know, rather than thinking about ourselves in those ways, I think we can take immense pride in the fact that we support users developing those information skills at every life stage. So from, you know, very early years intervention going right through formal education, you know, emerging interest around post-16 and adult education. How do people make use of information and information skills in their workplace? What's the impact on health? How do people make sure that they're using information to develop life skills and citizenship? And then right through into lifelong learning and active aging. And so there is so much we can do to equip people to live well in the society we're building, developing reading literacy, digital skills, critical thinking, media and information and political literacy, promoting dialogue and understanding, and then fundamentally, and you know, I'm not going to use the phrase levelling up for obvious reasons, but social mobility. A society grows great when every member of it has equal opportunity to learn and to share and to contribute to its cultural life. And that's what we ought to be aspiring to do as librarians. And then there is a very solid business and economic case behind what we're doing, which doesn't always get the airing it needs to, but we're going to try and make sure it does in the years ahead. So we've got 3 huge industrial and economic challenges. Productivity, we rank 15th out of the G7 for productivity, which we can only address by working smarter. Innovation, the kind of competitive economy that we say we want to build, depends on our ability to create new interdisciplinary ideas. And social mobility, our ability to compete globally, is going to be about harnessing all of our human capital, wherever people live, whatever their background, however much money their parents have. You know, this is about unlocking the potential in absolutely everybody. And we as librarians in all sectors are right in the middle of that. You know, it is creating the conditions for closing the productivity gap, driving innovation, unlocking the capital in our population. And that, I think, is a message we're going to need to shout from the rooftops as we advocate in the years ahead. So I'll close really with just a couple of thoughts. The past 15 months have been incredibly tough. You know, I'm not underestimating that at all. At the same time, it has proven time and again the value of a strong and united library and information profession, whichever part of the sector you're in. And I think we should take a moment to be proud of what we've been able to do, the difference we've been able to make, the stories we can tell about what our profession did when society needed us in a public health crisis. But I circle back to this really. We've got to be kind to ourselves and look after each other and our colleagues. We've got to come together as a profession and show solidarity. We've got to, and are, I mean, I know brilliantly, I've heard so many stories of how you are across Manchester, connecting with the users in a very honest and open and participatory way. I think there's a newfound confidence and pride in our purpose as libraries. I mean, there always was in Manchester, let's face it, as Neil says, you are the original library city, but I think we're seeing that across the whole of the UK, building new and interesting partnerships of value to make impact, not replacing the physical with the digital, but connecting in new ways, I think is going to be really important. And then getting out there and making sure we get paid for it. So making sure that we get those messages to those decision makers who need to hear all of that. So thank you. It's been amazing to be involved. Great discussions with Ivan in sort of preparation for today. You have such an incredible and inspiring community across Manchester and such a brilliant place in MMU, I have to say, as well as a foundry of new thinking. So if there's anything you'd like to ask me today, please do. But also if there's anything you'd like to follow up on from today's talk, you can contact me. And if you're not a member of our community yet, but would like to be, we would love to have you. So the link to join as a member is on screen. At which point I think I'm probably handing back to Ivan. Is that right? For questions.
That's right, Nick.
Brilliant. Shall I stop sharing?
Stop sharing. I'll join you shortly. I'm here. Thank you so much, Nick. That was extraordinary in terms of the clear-sightedness that you brought to where we are and what we've been through. And I think you're absolutely right. We are still in crisis mode. So I think it's a lot of good suggestions and thoughts and strategies about how we deal with this. And you're at the picture you're painting about what's coming up. We've known, but it's good to hear that with such clarity. And thank you for all the data and the links. Just to remind delegates, we will share presentations with you afterwards, so you will receive those. And I was just, again, if you're only joining us today, I would urge you to have a look at yesterday's talks that are online on YouTube, on the Manchester City of Literature channel. We originally conceived yesterday as being about trust, today about being the future, but if you look back, you'll see that actually that's a false divide. And I think both days speak to each other really well. We've had quite a few questions that I'm going to get to, Nick. I was just going to see, I think hopefully you've seen it in the chat, but there was a comment to say that the only time they cried during the pandemic was in response to the kindness of a CILIP membership person supporting them. So I thought that was a lovely comment. We've got about 10 minutes or so we haven't got much time. There's quite a lot of questions. Going back to you finished on it, Nick, decision makers. Can you say a bit more about which decision makers we should be targeting to enable them to understand the value of libraries and information services?
Yeah, thanks. It's actually
what works. What do you think works?
Yeah, so and lovely to see you, Jeff, by the way. and I have the checks in the post for the mention of MMU. What a wonderful organisation. All of them, I think, is the obvious answer. So we've just had local elections, which were extraordinary. There were more than 2,500 vacancies up for election, including metro mayors and local councillors and so on. And each one of those people is in a position to help and to inform decisions, because they're the people in Star Chamber, they're the people in the right room on the right day to make that decision. National politics is in a difficult place, I think, having done advocacy for 25 years. And so, it's very much policy by Marcus Rashford that we live in at the moment. If somebody can make enough of a fuss about an issue, then perhaps reactively some money and policy will be thrown at it. But even there, I think the answer is the same, which is what was told to me by a lobbyist recently, which is whoever it is, we have to give them a better idea of what they can do to help. And so fundamentally, whether we think people are anti-intellectual or, intentionally undermining some cities rather than others, we need to tell them that story about why we should be building libraries and knowledge infrastructure, because it isn't about right or left, it isn't about their political affiliation, it is actually practical economics. And the practical economics says that we need to be getting ready. And so what I'm committed to doing, we've built up a network of about 82 parliamentarians. We're building up a network of a couple of hundred local politicians and elected members as well. And we're telling them that story. We're saying, here's the evidence, here's the story about the difference that we can make, and here's what you can do about it. So long answer to a short question, Jeff, but all of them. But I think we need to be giving them a better idea of the decisions they can support that lead to better outcomes for libraries.
And another question, well, you've touched on the answer, because somebody's talking about, in the UK and other parts of Europe and the world, we do have populist governments who are against learning and knowledge organisations. And I think what you've just touched on there is, avoiding that trap of political arguments, and falling into the trap of left or right, and actually giving them the evidence and showing them how it helps solutions.
Absolutely. And I think, this is partly why we're turning to economics at the moment, because a lot of the social arguments aren't landing in the way we need them to because of the flavour of some of the political discourse. But the economics are sort of irrefutable, really. The fact that if you're going to compete globally, you need everybody to have an equal chance to learn and to know and to access information. Isn't about suppressing the voting population. It's about, opening up potential and opportunity and building future ideas. So what we as a professional body can do, and I think, to be honest, one of the reasons why you have a professional body is put forward the argument consistently and well. And consistently matters, because I think one of the things I would always say is that what we're living through now is only what we're living through now. The long arc of politics changes frequently, and so we need to stand for those core principles of the universal right to access information and learn, the rights of the individual to privacy and to intellectual freedom, and we need to stand for those things in fair weather and foul. And I think that's key to us, is building those networks of influence and then being consistent in that messaging, whatever type of administration we're working with.
And I think, thinking back to Marie and Neil's presentation, again, about that idea of a network, of community infrastructure. And again, I think that's something that libraries have that's quite unique about that neighbourhood reach. So I'm just thinking at a local level as well. It's not always easy, but I think, again, getting local councillors, not just aware and informed and with evidence, but actually into libraries. I mean, almost like a lot of the public who might not have been in a public library for 15, 20 years, they do need to see the spaces and see the activity and hear from their constituents, hear from people about the value.
I do think we've got a complex challenge there, and I think it's come up in one of the other questions about brand. I mean, I wouldn't touch the library brand. I think it's the best brand in the world. It's, I know many corporate partners that would kill to have the kind of trust and visibility of that brand. But we live in an age of simplifications, and the issue is that libraries have come to be known by the processes they manage, not their social purpose. And that's the dial we need to shift, is not using the word library, but what that word means. And I think you do start at grassroots. You do say to local political stakeholders, whether that's lobby groups or elected members or, you know, people on their local street activating for better potholes. It is fundamentally the most egalitarian and available platform for civic participation there is in the UK, the public library. And it belongs to them and it's free. And so if you want to appropriate the means of local power, then the public library is the best organising platform you could have. And I think getting that message out about social purpose rather than, you know, these are the activities that you can see on the poster is going to be really key.
We had a question here which was asking you to polish a crystal ball, Nick, but about whether in the pandemic this will change that trajectory about people living in cities or not. And I don't know if you've got any views on that.
Yeah, hi Sue. I went back to a couple of organisations and asked them this question, and I think the view was partly hedging, it's too early to tell, but partly also I think it's really only the people in cities that can afford to that have moved out into rural areas. And so actually while it sort of seems like a trend, I think it's a fairly limited group of people, whereas the general sort of influx into cities is because of work and because of sort of earnings and so on. So I think the view that I've been told is there might be a small kind of fluctuation back the other way, but in general, the trend over the next 20, 30 years is bigger cities and moving away from rural spaces, which is terrible. I mean, I'm not in any way presenting that as a virtue. I love our rural spaces and it's really important. But I think just on a simple demographic point of view, you know, what have we got at the moment? One library for 25,000 head of population in the UK. European average is one library, public library servicing 14,000. So, you know, if we just went by numbers rather than politics, we ought to be building a lot more libraries.
Thank you so much, Nick. We unfortunately don't have any time for any more questions, but you're very kind to share your details there if anybody did want to follow up. To delegates, obviously, I hope you're joining us this afternoon, where we're going into discussion groups on some of the many topics raised this morning. One thing that I'm particularly taking away from what you said, Nick, was around social justice. It's very potent, and to borrow another quotation, which is the thinking about this theme where we talk to you about the future, William Gibson quotation that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And I think you're right, there's a real need for libraries and for us as individuals to be part of the solution for addressing that. So thank you again for such an inspirational and clear-sighted talk. Really valuable, really value you being part of the Festival of Libraries. So we'll take a 5-minute break now, and we'll be back just after 11:45. So see you shortly, everybody. Thank you.
Here we are at Manchester Poetry Library. It's the big rose gold and white building on Oxford Road. And as you can tell, we're right in the busy heart of the city. Manchester Poetry Library is a growing library. It's brand new and it's your library. You can become a part of it. So come in and join in. Welcome to Manchester Poetry Library. It's the first poetry library in the Northwest and it's growing. It's going to be focusing particularly on 20th and 21st century poetry, Manchester community languages and poetry in recording. Manchester has 200 community languages. And one of the things that the Manchester Poetry Library is most proud about is that they aim to have all of them represented in the collection. So far, there's Bohdan Piasecki and Jennifer Lee Sy, so that's Polish, and in Tigrinya, and there's going to be 198 more. This is going to be a wonderful resource for people to explore community languages and particularly the world of poetry in all those languages. One of the interesting things about Manchester Poetry Library is, as you can tell, it's a brand new building. But Manchester being what it is, and I love the way that Manchester is a city built in layers, it's built on the site of Charlton on Medlock Town Hall, which was the venue for the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945. Something else you might not know about Manchester Poetry Library is there are going to be 3 levels of membership: adult, young people and children. And the Growing Children section is co-curated by the lovely Mandy Coe, and she's had advice and suggestions and ideas from all over the world.
Libraries are inspirational.
Libraries are free. Just stop and think about that a minute. Just have that moment, just think. Libraries are free.
I'd say libraries are alive.
Libraries are listening spaces.
Everywhere you go in Manchester, there's a library. Manchester is Library City. It is home to some of the most amazing, spectacular libraries.
I just think libraries are essential. Library is an open space for everyone.
Libraries are a home from home.
Libraries are places of sanctuary.
Libraries are fun.
Libraries are activators of change.
Libraries seem to be the best kept secret, so I'm sharing this secret with you.
Hello everybody, welcome back. I hope you managed to get yourself that tea or coffee that you deserve in that short break. We'll shortly, very shortly, have our final presentation for this morning, sorry. Just to remind you about this afternoon, you'll be joining using a different login and we'll be in small discussion groups to look at some of the themes today. Just to remind you, a lot of you said that you're really interested in networking and meeting people from different parts of the UK, different parts of the world, and also from different libraries. So whether that's academic, medical, specialist or public libraries. So do join us this afternoon. I'll remind you of the timings when we finish this morning. So one of the films we just showed you there was around Manchester Poetry Library. We were very proud of libraries in Manchester, as I hope you're gathered from yesterday and today. And in Chetham's Library, which is the oldest, built in 1653, but it's in a building that was created in 1420. So it's the oldest public library in the English-speaking world. So there's a whole series of heritage libraries in Manchester, but we're delighted that this year we will have a new library that's already active digitally. You saw in the film just before a quick tour of it, and it will later this year be opening its doors to the public. That's Manchester Poetry Library, hosted at Manchester Metropolitan University. So our next talk is from Becky Swain, who's the director of the Poetry Library. So I'm going to hand over now to Becky to talk about the way in which they're building an inclusive collection in this very new building.
And thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ivan. I hope you can see my screen to show my presentation. Manchester Poetry Library building an inclusive collection. It's great to be able to join you for the Knowledge Exchange as part of the first Festival of Libraries. I'm really struck by Marie and Neil MacInnes and Nick Poole's idea of the library as a space for participation and dialogue and a listening space. You'll have noticed in the short video that played just before Ivan spoke that one of my colleagues, Martin Kratz, describes public libraries as listening spaces. And I hope that will be a key note of this presentation this morning in terms of how listening has played a part in building an inclusive collection. Not least because we've learned from a network of UK poetry libraries that we co-founded in 2018, and Manchester Public Libraries and libraries across the globe, including Denmark and the co-creation toolkit that Marie mentioned. And especially as part of a two-day knowledge exchange where we're learning from each other. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Poetry Library and to share 3 examples of how we're building an inclusive collection. Please do post questions in the Q&A, and I look forward to conversation after the presentation. I think it's important to be explicit about why I've chosen to insert the word inclusive, rather than just talking about building a poetry collection. It's a word that can feel like policy jargon, but it's absolutely intentional. Inclusion for us is the act of including, being made part of something as distinct from celebrating diversity. As it is for other organisations that aim to be open to all, we're willing to put the time in to understand barriers and to seek and overcome them. So for us, diversity is the what and inclusion the how, as in diversity focuses on the makeup of our collection by our members and partners, whether that explores some of the many identities of being human, whether that's race, gender, disability, sexuality, class, and any other intersectionality. And inclusion is a measure of culture that enables diversity to thrive. So we are trying to make inclusion a daily habit. And it's helpful to be reminded by Nick that a poetry library is never finished. That's helpful to know when you're starting a poetry library. And we certainly have a starting collection that I want to talk about. For developing a collection that includes or tries to represent the community from which it serves, there is a focus on decolonizing, a loaded phrase, the process of the how of building a more diverse collection. So wider than a historical or chronological canon of poetry that in the past may have been marginalized, marginalizing poets of color, for example, in favor of a narrow canon. We want to ensure that the poetry collection is representative of the diversity of the region, and it's about equity, not simply developing an offer and saying it's open to all, but designing that library and arts learning experience in the way that Marie has talked about in terms of co-learning with communities and giving the power back to the people whose library belongs to them. As Chris McCabe, head librarian at the National Poetry Library, says, poetry is influenced by culture. No one knows where the next shoots will come from. Who knew that Instagram poetry would become such a dynamic and energized space for young people who hadn't connected to poetry through education? So rather than decolonizing a library, we prefer to describe it as liberating a collection. And when you start a new collection, you bring to the fore poets from the past that may not have been celebrated or studied, particularly hidden voices. And as many of you know, Manchester is a city of wonderful poets and a city rich in libraries, as we've heard this morning. And as the first public poetry library in the Northwest, we're building a selection of books and recordings of contemporary poetry, including plans to develop a multimedia archive of poetry and performance over the last 70 or so years. And we'll do that with partners, including public libraries, grassroots communities. Actually, we do everything in partnership. Over the Festival of Libraries of the next 4 days, we'll be working with over 10 partners for all the events that we're hosting. So we aim to be not just a collection of books and recordings, but a program of events, open as a physical space, but also creating virtual ley lines as we've had to this year. So a little bit about, for some reason I can't show my next slide. Here we are. So the first public poetry library in the Northwest and the first within a university in the UK. The Poetry Library builds on the expertise and research within Manchester Writing School, and over many decades with director Carol-Ann Duffy, and including poets such as Andrew Macmillan, Malika Booker, Jean Sprackland, Michael Simmons Roberts, Helen Mort, and many more. Each in different ways has done so much to advocate for poetry in schools and beyond. And as Nick Poole reminds us, Manchester Metropolitan University is also very much a university of firsts. So we're building on that community engagement expertise as well as poetry. And just something to say about what we mean by poetry. We believe that poetry is for everyone, as in when people feel poetry is not for them, they may have good reason. It could be a bad experience of learning at school. And in many cases, in our experience, it may be that they simply haven't found the right poem for them. Poetry is not about a person who possesses special powers of imagination and expression, suggesting that a poem is a result of inspiration that only a certain kind of person, a genius, can inspire. What we think about poetry is that it's a making, a craft. And when people think about poetry as a craft, we think about it in terms of tools and techniques that can be taught and can be taught to anyone. So in a city of the highest language density in Western Europe, with potentially 200 languages, we knew when we started the collection we wanted to represent those languages. For us, building an inclusive collection is about co-curation. And I just want to, I've mentioned programs of events and activities that will be open to the public, but to mention Manchester City of Literature and the role that City of Literature has played in bringing libraries and cultural organisations together for festivals just such as this. It enables us to amplify what we're doing across not just Manchester and Greater Manchester, but as you can see today, the globe. And you'll see from a couple of examples that I'm going to give, what a force that has been in terms of the reach of the Poetry Library, even though we're not open. So I mentioned that we'll be a public lending library, like any other library, with a focus on Manchester's status as a city of literature, with a network of 30 organisations across the city. We also work with national partners, such as the British Council, the Poetry Archive, and with UNESCO Cities and Cities of Literature, who have kindly donated poems to us. We were due to open in June 2020, but COVID had other plans for us. But while we're not physically open, we've welcomed 500 people to our programme of events. And as part of our programmes, we've been asking over the last 3 years the question, what is a poetry library? And I want to just ask you to take a moment to think for yourself, maybe jot something down in your notebook, feel free to put it in the chat, and end to that sentence, a poetry library is. Just take a moment to think about what you think a poetry library is. And I think it's important to think and ask people individually. I've done this with librarians, groups of health librarians, with pupils, and we've had amazing answers. Answers like, a poetry library is something every city should have. A poetry library expresses our poetry history, it expresses hidden voices, and a few that we really wanted to take forward in terms of how we plan the library. A poetry library is a place to celebrate the power of poetry, a place to explore language in all its diversity, and is a space to explore what it means to be human. I think a poetry library is connected to each community, growing the next shoots of poetry culture was one of my favourites. So the idea of a poetry library being for everyone, whether children and families, teachers, schools, librarians, whether those librarians have confidence and a love of poetry, or some poetry anxiety, which we understand, NHS staff, adults, poets, poetry enthusiasts. So in terms of the collection, in a bit more detail, it's a starting collection of 10,000 books, periodicals, recordings, audiovisual and digital content, and 5 distinct themes, including, as I mentioned, a multimedia archive, we hope, of poetry for performance that has happened across Manchester in the last 70 years. So as well as seeking to represent the languages of Manchester with a programme about poetry and languages, we also have a focus on recording with children, poetry and place, working with the Manchester Met Centre for Place Writing, and poetry in collaboration. For example, this weekend we're collaborating with the nursing department within the university and health librarians and professionals to look at exploring poetry in health and social care settings. So the first example I want to give of three about co-curation is we wanted to give an example of how we developed our Chinese poetry collection. First of all, why Chinese? It's a long-term aspiration and a key part of the languages collection that the Poetry Library will be a space for ongoing dialogue about poetry across a range of different languages. To do so, we wanted to start with some of the most spoken languages in Manchester, including Chinese, Urdu, Polish, Arabic, and we also wanted to include an African language, which will probably be Somali. Secondly, we wanted to recognise the idea of language communities in their widest sense, not just for native speakers of different community languages, but for those whom a particular language may be part of their family and heritage, even though they don't speak that language. And thirdly, we wanted to grow a programme that reflects conversations with events that are translated and untranslated. And this year, an event with Ribka Sabatu, a poet who lives in exile in Italy. So in 2019, just as one example, we had a launch tour for the collection My Tenantless Body by the Sichuan poet Yu Yo-Yo that led to a conversation with the Manchester Confucius Institute and also the poet Jennifer Lee Tsai. Jennifer then worked with us to co-curate the Chinese collection. Now, co-curation, in the sense that Marie mentioned co-creation, is very much a reciprocal process, a two-way process. And each of those co-curations is led by a poet who connects with that language community and gives recommendations and reflections following events, consultations, and opportunities with members of the Chinese language speaking community in Greater Manchester. And this year we hosted the launch of our Chinese poetry collection with Kit Fan and Natalie Lynn Boulderston as part of the city's International Mother Language Day celebrations. Our next step is to develop a collection and programme in each of the languages that develops organically and quite differently. At the moment, we're connecting with the British Council's Digital Collaborations Through Culture programme, something I recommend for any public library as well as arts organisation, in terms of it's not necessarily funding, but being connected to organisations internationally. For us, it's the Dofu Thatched Cottage Museum in Chengdu that celebrates the Tang Dynasty poet Dofu, but also celebrates Chinese contemporary poetry. And it's a digital collaboration where we'll set up an exchange of donations from the library in Chengdu with the aim of creating a branch library at the Manchester Poetry Library and vice versa. So again, about an exchange between two potentially very different cultures, but we find that the poetry is often about human experience and very, very similar themes. So the second example I wanted to give was an event that we led to choose poems around the celebration of the 75th anniversary in October last year of the Pan-African Congress. Rosie Garland, in the film about the Poetry Library, if you saw it 15 minutes ago, talked about the site of the Poetry Library and Manchester Met Arts and Humanities building being the Charlton on Medlock Town Hall. And the event brought together prominent intellectuals and activists who'd go on to become influential leaders in both the African independence movement and American civil rights movement. And we wanted to honour such a major event in the 20th century where decisions led to independence of African countries from colonial rule. At the time in 1945, the Congress scarcely had a mention in the news, but history has shown it to be a crucial moment that has inspired much action. And the event, Voices for Freedom, was to be a live event that honoured the fathers and grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers who took part in that Manchester event. But of course, COVID had other plans for us. So we set about speaking to Sue Andy, a Manchester-based poet and playwright, and also the director of the National Black Arts Alliance. This was happening, producing this event with Sue Andy was happening in the months after the murder of George Floyd in the US. You know, Nick Poole talked about social justice being a library issue, and we were met with an intensity that we had to keep hold of and bring into that event. We worked closely with Suandi to connect with relatives and descendants of those who took part in the conference, choosing the pieces of poetry readings of original and existing work. And each piece was chosen by a family member, a fusion of oral history, dance, a cappella, poetry, and extracts from writers, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Merle Collins, and Suandi. I never forget the poem that Suandi wrote as an original poem for this event. It's called Tired of Protesting Outside. And I just want to read the first stanza of it. I'm tired of protesting outside. I want to be inside, where it's warm and they're serving coffee with odd tasting sandwiches and biscuits single wrapped. You can throw your crumbs to the birds. I've taken to the streets so many times my feet are blistered. Can I now stand by the lectern with a microphone instead of my mouth working like a megaphone? And there's certainly a role with a project like this in terms of our conversations with Suandi and those participants, that we have a responsibility as a public poetry library that celebrates poetry and the power of the civic power of libraries to step forward, you know, to think through the social justice issues of our time and make sure that our programme responds to them and gives a platform for voices. The film included new commissions by Ronald Sams, and Kevin E. Turner from Company Chameleon, with a musical score by Kevin Daly. And young Ziny Mackenzie spoke of her pride that her great-great-grandfather, Alfred Lawrence, had been part of the Pan-African Congress delegation. With my brothers and sisters across our family and 50 members, we are descendants of people who have contributed to Manchester in so many professions: local community activists, educators, foster parents, so many, but most importantly, we are fifth generation Afro-Mancunians, Pan-Africans. And through, I think, an intergenerational project, one of the participants, Anne Sarge, in the film says that reading David Rubaderi opened doors to her in terms of poetry. She had never been interested in poetry. And audience members have fed back, you can feel the power of connection and pride in the voices of present-day relatives. Another said, I don't know much about Pan-Africanism, but this really has inspired me to explore more. And to be fair, as a team at the Poetry Library, we didn't know much about Pan-Africanism and needed to learn. And we created a publication to explore the Pan-African experience, which now has a pride of place within the collection. And the poets that were chosen for that event, we've made sure that we have collections of their poems on the shelves. But there is a way of, you know, it's relatively easy to think of a list of books of poetry that have been published and buy them. But actually finding poetry that connects to the people in the region and that has been chosen by those people in the region feels very, very different. And people are telling us so. So one last example of co-curation before I finish. We wanted to share a little about the beginnings of our collection for poetry for children. As we were told in the film by Rosie Garland, Mandy Coe, poet, illustrator, and all-round Wonder Woman educator, helped us co-curate the starting collection that will grow and grow from here. Mandy is a poet who has worked in many public libraries across Manchester, many schools, and she asked organisations with specialist knowledge of poetry for children to respond across the world. So the collection touches on so many subjects. Swati Roy, the director of Buckaroo in New Delhi, recommended All the Colours of the Earth, a multicultural treasury. And Asari Beale at the Teachers and Writers Collective in New York represented The Bat Poet, obviously a collection about a bat that wants to be a poet. I mean, the power of the imagination is important. Literature Wales recommended The Lost Words by Robert Macfarlane and Julie Morris. And the Poetry Society suggested Rising Stars, New Voices in Poetry. In time, we plan to include poetry in the collection that celebrates from a range of projects, including Manchester Met's Mother Tongue, Other Tongue project, open to 8 to 18-year-olds, and also Manchester Public Libraries Made in Manchester project, a multilingual poem reaching 64 languages, which will be added to as an everlasting poem and will sit just outside the doors of Manchester Poetry Library. And one of the first goals of the co-curation was to ensure that the first books on the shelves, as I've said at least 3 times, reflect the community in Manchester. The collection will be rich with books and recordings in translation and in the first language, and in first language, and our year-round programme of musha'iras, readings and commissions of translation will celebrate that. So we've been careful to think about a collection that also has a kind of third category for poets and educators and writers who use poetry in their work. Our hope is that that category will support librarians, teachers, teacher writers and writers who visit schools, and help the Poetry Library develop a programme that shares innovative ways of teaching poetry. So Mandy has written about her experience of developing the collection in a blog post for CILIP back in November, for those of you who are interested in more detail. It's called The Adventures of Co-Curating a Poetry Library Collection for Children. And the collection touches on so many subjects again: Our Difficult Sunlight, a guide to poetry, literacy and social justice in the classroom, From Medusa to the Sky, teaching writing to children with special needs, and Somos como la nubos, we are like the clouds. And we're confident that the collection relates to both the public and the personal. We hope that children, parents, and all readers interested and curious about poetry will have a chance to visit and borrow from this new public library. Again, just to explore what it means to be human, and a place that celebrates the power of the imagination. Each event includes a resource, parents and carers to draw out poems and consider how they might be used in the classroom, and of course at home, as we've seen in the last year. You can imagine, with all of these co-curation activities, one poem or one collection can be incredibly powerful and have an impact on young lives or those who are older in our community. And the shelves are already teeming with poetic journeys of the imagination. It's going to grow over months and years to come. And if you have any suggestions of anthologies or single author collections that you think we should have in the collection, do tell us. I did want to say just a couple of things about the public programme. I think, bearing in mind the intergenerational nature of public libraries, we want to make sure that we foreground the children's, young people and adults as borrowers and have distinct programmes for each. So if any of you in public libraries have, internationally or regionally, locally, have ideas for projects, do get in touch with us, and I'll leave my contact details at the end. We plan digital and face-to-face events and a complete hybrid. You know, we've not been able to open, but actually having digital events, films like the Voices for Freedom film has been seen by over 1,000 people when we may have had 150 for an event. So it's been an interesting way that we've had to respond to the pandemic. 2 projects, Manchester Mother Tongue, Other Tongue, and Right Where We Are Now are worth a mention. And Malala Yousafzai, the youngest Nobel Peace Prize winner, has mentioned that, you know, in terms of our cultural heritage, languages are so important and a great way not just to celebrate them, but to explore our common humanity across different languages. And since 2012, over 30,000 pupils have taken part. Through the pandemic, we've had a record number of applications this year, with 2,243 pupils taking part. Mother Tongue, Other Tongue enables people to share. So if English is not your first language, a lullaby, a poem or a song in your mother tongue. And the Other Tongue category encourages children who are learning another language at school to use that language to create or write a poem of their own in that language. And a Year 9 student said it's the best thing to be able to see each other's language and what other people hold dear to them. And just a quick mention for Right Where We Are Now, and any public libraries who are interested in developing poetry competitions at this point, or just as Nick says, you know, it's a time when people want to express their pain, talk about what's happening to them. Carol Ann Duffy launched a project where she invited professional poets to write about their experience of lockdown. And we were inundated beyond that with the public writing to Carol Ann Duffy with a poem of their own about what it's been like to live in this time. So we've started to create a public poetry archive. If you click on the link, you can submit a poem, and there's a kind of ethical approval process of whether you want to share that publicly. And we aim to revisit those poems as a reflection of this year. So everything we do, as I've mentioned, is in partnership. We've been exploring cities through poetry over the last month, and Ivan and the City of Literature team were instrumental in connecting us with UNESCO Cities network, and 13 different countries, including Dunedin, a City of Literature, have sent images, books, recommendations that you can see on our Instagram account. We've been following a map around the world, traveling by train mostly, virtual train, and trying not to fly. So we're still learning in terms of co-curation. We hope that we're starting to build a collection that is including as many voices, as many publications, as many recordings as our membership and borrowers lean in to tell us about. And also we need to do detective work. I think librarians are fantastic detectives, and in terms of developing a poetry collection, having poetry detectives that someone comes into our poetry library and asks for a book about celebrating their daughter's 21st birthday. Can I have a poem that would do that for me? Or you've sadly lost someone during the pandemic and you want to honor that person. Often we turn to poetry to do that. And I think the librarians working in the poetry library will work together to think about as wide a possible kind of bank of poems that we can offer as a kind of springboard for people who come for their first visit and perhaps don't know poetry. So the library will never be finished. We hope you'll join us in developing that collection and stories, that you will tell us about what you would like. Any ideas for books and recordings or ideas and projects, do please let us know. And if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, in the Q&A even.
Thank you, Becky. Well, if you could stop sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Becky. As you talked about, myself and the team at Manchester City of Literature, we do work very closely with yourself and your team at the Poetry Library, but it's wonderful to hear you present each time, because I can see the next stage of the journey that you've just been on, that you've just completed, and you're reflecting on it. And I found out something new. It's a wonderful story for a building that isn't physically open yet. I think it's just wonderful, and I like that idea of how much you've taken from the concept of the library is not finished. We've got a couple of questions for you. Can I ask? This is from Helen. Is asking, do you think being part of a university is a barrier rather than a public library itself? Does that create a barrier, and how might you be addressing that?
Yeah, I think in many ways, for particularly people new to poetry or who might need poetry demystifying, that it's a difficult thing. Often is, particularly if you've had a bad experience in education, that poetry is about criticizing a poem and whether you get it right or wrong. I think what we've decided in terms of conversations within the university is that we have a main All Saints University library, which, as part of this festival is running, love reading events, one with Andrew Macmillan. But that poetry library, that All Saints library has critical reflections on poetry as well as poetry collections. What you'll find at the poetry library, because it's public and because we wanted to have a different feel in terms of developing new voices in poetry, is that we won't have that criticism. We'll have the poetry itself and let it speak for itself. Obviously, if you read poetry by a particular poet and want to find out more, there are other ways you can do that online, but that's possibly not our role at the Poetry Library. I think in terms of being a barrier, I think we're in a part of town that is full of universities. I think there are some residents I know that never come along Oxford Road. And I think initially we might work with grassroots partners. We've worked with 42nd Street, with Longsight Library, a group called Afro Cats working for closed workshops where we are actually going to that group rather than expecting a group to come to us. So I think it's going to be a lot of intentional work in a way that Marie talked about co-creation. If you really want to understand the barriers to people coming into your space, you have to find alternative ways to engage, what might historically have been called outreach. I would never say it's about trying to reach hard to reach communities. I think we are the ones that are hard to reach because we're in the centre of a city. You've got to get on a bus to get to us, and we're behind a gate. It's not just poetry might be difficult. Somebody might find reading difficult, and they might find the idea of higher education difficult. So yeah, we've got lots of barriers to break. Good question, Helen. We think about it a lot.
I mean, one reflection, Becky, if you took off the Manchester Metropolitan University and Shield from your presentation, I think most people would not say that was a university presentation. So again, I think, just in terms of actions. And for those of you who don't know Manchester, the Poetry Library is on Oxford Road, which is one of the main arterial routes from the south into the city. So it's a very bustling area. The university campus is part of the city centre. So, and the Poetry Library is right on that road, glass-fronted building. So it doesn't look, it's not a campus that turns away from the public.
No, and actually something I didn't mention at all, I could have done in another presentation, is the work we do with students. Just one example, in the Mother Tongue competition, over the last week, we've had 17 judges who are students who speak languages from Arabic to Urdu to Spanish, Italian. So 2 or 3 students speaking that language come together and judge poems that have been submitted in that category. And every year they play a hugely important ambassadorial role in that project. And at the moment, we've got 12 student-led projects in the Poetry Library, some of them which will lead to creating community groups and readings, and others will be a guide to the collection on a particular theme. So the students are working with us, but it's not necessarily just focusing on their studies. It's more, how can you devise something that will engage with the public? And to do that, you have to have a conversation about what inclusion means.
Can I ask, Becky, because I know you and your team, are all highly experienced, highly trained professionals, and you're having to shift the way that you work, for this co-creation model. So you mentioned before you could simply go and buy poetry collections. So you could simply be a curator. So what's it been like for you and the team? Is there anything you can share about what you've learned to make that shift to be much more of a facilitator?
Well, I've only been at the Poetry Library as director for 18 months. I would say for 5 years. The university and the wonderful staff at the writing school and Martin Kratz, the project manager, have been developing this idea of a poetry library. And it's something about the way that the team, and Martin Kratz in particular, has been listening and hasn't just taken a kind of academic approach of, we are exceptionally expert in poetry, we will draw up a series of lists. We have done that because we need to have a comprehensive collection, but beyond the list is what we started to talk about, and how the list is put together. In terms of what budget we have each year, how will we direct that budget? Will it just be buying every publication that's been published that year in poetry, or do we want to dig deep and investigate? That's what I meant by being a poetry detective. If you find that, an example is many of the poetry written by Black poets through the 70s, 80s and 90s was not published. And brilliant poetry that didn't find its way into a physical form of a book, but it's in either recording or in, Lem Cisse, when he first started as a poet, developed his own pamphlet. So that self-publishing idea is nothing new. But where do you find those when, you know, they're rare? So that poetry detective work is what I mean. And we've had lots of communication with poets across Manchester who are trying to help us find and unearth poetry that isn't in public libraries. No fault of public libraries, they're just not, you're not able to buy them.
I love that concept of the idea of beyond the list.
Beyond the list, yeah.
I've got a question now that which will probably draw on your poetry expertise, which is this is from Jeff. And I know you were away yesterday, so you weren't able to hear some of yesterday's presentations. But we talked at several points, obviously, and Nick Poole mentioned it as well before, that as much as a pandemic, we've had an infodemic, and there's been a lot of mis and disinformation, you know, in the media, in our public discourse, in social media, across social media. And the question from Jeff is, could poetry be used as a way of tackling mis and disinformation in a more entertaining and engaging way?
I think it's a very, very good suggestion. I think often poetry gets to the heart of issues. If you think about when George Floyd was murdered last summer, Manchester very, very quickly, through the City of Literature and, you know, Rhys Williams in your team, put together Our City Speaks, which were, you know, which was a platform for poets across Manchester to say what was on their mind and how they responded to that event. Sometimes with existing poems, because it's something that's been on their mind, obviously, for decades. It's not just the death of George Floyd that brings up that anger about institutional racism. And it spoke to people, not just intellectually, but absolutely to the heart. And I think that's something Malika Booker describes poetry as, you know, it can cut to the heart of the matter and describe things that are almost too uncomfortable to speak about. And I think, you know, Nick talked about it being Empathy Day. There's something for me about poetry helping you understand yourself and the world around you. And it is one person's perspective, but when you come across a really fantastic poem, it's because, for me, it's because it connects with me. Not necessarily I learn something, but I feel as though I can not just see myself reflected, but that it gives me a chance to understand a little bit more about what it means to be human. I use that phrase a lot, and I really mean it, because I think Neil and Marie and Nick talked about common humanity, and that libraries can be a democratic space to participate and be together, simply to be together. And when seismic events happen, you need to help people be together, because there can be some discomfort, and I think poetry can help do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Becky. That's all the time we have for questions. I would encourage people to have a look at the Right Where We Are Now archive. Painful as it is, though we're still in the crisis, to revisit that, it's quite an extraordinary resource. And just to mention, throughout the Festival of Libraries, we have a whole series of artist residencies. So we have artists based in a lot of libraries in lots of different settings. Just to pick on a couple, we have 3 writers and 3 technologists have been based with libraries as part of our Future Libraries programme. And Charlotte Wetton and David McFarlane have been working with the Poetry Library and with the collections there to create a digital installation. Now, most of the work that's been created is available online. This one isn't, sadly, for those of you not in Manchester, but if you are in city centre Manchester, that installation is at Central Library. And basically it will interact with somebody passing by the window. So if you are in Manchester, I would urge you to check that out, and you'll see some of the work from the Poetry Library collection there. And we also have some international links. We have 2 international writers in residency, one at the Portico, one at Central Library. And to go back to Future Libraries, there is a webinar tonight at 6 p.m. Where the technologists and writers will be talking about Future Libraries. There should be a link in chat shortly, or you can visit the Manchester City of Literature.com website. And yet those international writers in residency are doing some Instagram live conversations tomorrow. So we have Alicia sometimes from Melbourne. She'll be speaking at 11 a.m. tomorrow with local writer Kate Feld, and Anna Pologny, who's from Iowa, City of Literature, is speaking at 1 p.m. So again, interesting. Both of them will be giving their perspectives on libraries as well as their writing. So thank you again, Becky. Thank you everyone for your time. We're going to take an hour's lunch break now. Please, I'd urge you to use your lunch break wisely. I would stay away from work email. I'd stay away from work if you can. Do read a book, read some poetry, have a walk, have a leisurely lunch, reflect on what you've heard this morning. I hope you can all join us back at 1:30. We'll be on a different link, remember, and this is your chance to meet other delegates. We'll be in small breakout rooms, and we'll be talking about some of the themes and what we've heard today and what it means for us individually. So please, thank you again to Becky, to Nick Poole, to Marie Østergård, and to Neil MacInnes. Thank you all for your attention this morning. Wish you a good lunchtime, and we'll see you on the different link at 1:30. Thank you very much, everyone.
Libraries are inspirational.
Libraries are free. Just stop and think about that a minute. Just have that moment, just think. Libraries are free.
I'd say libraries are alive.
Libraries are listening spaces.
Everywhere you go in Manchester, there's a library. Manchester is Library City. It is home to some of the most amazing, spectacular libraries.
I just think libraries are essential. Library is an open space for everyone.
Libraries are home from home.
Libraries are places of sanctuary.
Libraries are fun.
Libraries are activators of change.
Libraries seem to be the best kept secret, so I'm sharing this secret with you.